The door was sealed with nails that gleamed faintly in the candlelight. Outside, the street was empty, the mist folding gently over cobblestones slick with evening rain. A man in a rough wool cloak stood there for a moment, hammer trembling in his hand, staring at the wooden boards that would soon make a prison. Inside the house, he could hear voices, weak, pleading, already distant. One belonged to his wife. Another, barely a whisper, was his child's. He closed his eyes, lifted the hammer once more, and brought it down. Each strike echoed like a tolling bell, a sound that marked the end of everything he knew. When the last nail was driven, he stepped back, breathing hard, unable to move, unable to pray. The door he had sealed would never open again. The street was quiet except for the soft hum of flies that gathered near the gutters. The scent of smoke and sickness hung in the air, a strange, heavy stillness that had become part of every medieval town's evening song. A small wooden cross had been painted on the door in thick red paint. Above it, someone had scrawled the words, "Lord have mercy." They glowed in the dim light of a nearby lantern, uneven and desperate, a message not to the living, but to whatever power might still be listening. In those first nights of quarantine, time itself seemed to stop. Candles burned down to pools of wax, and behind every closed shutter, families whispered prayers, some for healing, others for swift ends. The world had grown very small, confined to the space between walls. Outside, the sound of carts creaked slowly past, carrying straw and lime and the faint memory of laughter that once filled these streets. The rhythm of life was now measured by how long the coughing continued, by how quickly silence followed. Within that locked house, the air was thick, unmoving. The mother held her child close, pressing a damp cloth to the child's forehead. The faint smell of vinegar and herbs filled the room, though everyone knew it did little. Still, people clung to rituals. They whispered blessings, burned sage, and hung branches of rue near the windows. Hope was fragile, but it was all they had. Outside the door, neighbors passed quickly, their faces covered, eyes averted. To look too long at that house was to invite fate's attention. The red cross was not just a warning, it was a mirror of every person's fear. The man who sealed the door returned home in silence, his shoes leaving small prints in the wet dirt. His house was only a few streets away, but it felt like miles. He could still hear the faint cries echoing in his mind. He had promised to bring bread and broth days ago, but when he reached the threshold that night, he knew he could not. The order had been given by the council. No one was to open a plague door, not even for blood. He obeyed, as everyone did, but the obedience felt like betrayal. Sleep did not come easily that night, nor any night after. Days later, the windows of the sealed house went dark. The last candle had burned out. The smell began soon after, sweet and foul, seeping through the cracks, carried by the wind. People crossed the street to avoid passing too near. Children were told not to look, though curiosity pulled at them like a whisper. A watchman was posted at the corner, his torch flickering against the stone walls, marking time for the dying within. The city had learned to look away, to let mercy mean silence. When dawn broke, fog rolled over the rooftops. Crows gathered in quiet flocks, perching on the chimney tops. The bells did not ring anymore. There were too many dead, and their constant tolling had begun to drive the living mad. In the damp gray light, the red cross on the door faded slightly, its edges bleeding into the wood. Behind it, stillness. The plague had no sound when it finished. It simply left emptiness. This was how it began in city after city. A single door sealed, then another, then entire streets painted in crimson. The sound of hammering became as familiar as church bells once were. Each door was a boundary between the known and the unknowable, between the world that still breathed and the one that whispered. The plague houses were not yet the grand institutions of later years. They were simple homes, bakeries, cottages, inns, turned into tombs overnight. As darkness fell again, a thin line of smoke rose from a chimney somewhere nearby. Someone, somewhere, was still alive, still believing that dawn might bring deliverance. But for most, dawn only revealed more crosses, more silence, more doors that would never open. The streets began to resemble a map of loss, marked in red and grief. Yet within that silence, the world seemed to hold its breath. For all its horror, there was a strange tenderness in the stillness, a sense of fragile humanity enduring beneath the weight of despair. The flicker of a candle through a window, the soft murmur of a prayer, the hand that trembled as it drew the final cross. These moments became the last language of the living. And as the wind swept through the narrow alleys, carrying with it the faint smell of rain and decay, it seemed to whisper the same question through every town and village. How many doors would be sealed before mercy finally came? Before the plague came, life in the medieval world carried a rhythm so steady that people mistook it for permanence. The mornings began with the tolling of church bells, echoing across cobblestone streets still damp with dew. Merchants lifted their shutters, children chased each other through narrow alleys, and bakers filled the air with the warm scent of rising bread. Farmers entered the city gates with carts of turnips and barley, monks walked in pairs whispering their prayers, and blacksmiths beat the first sparks of the day from iron. There was laughter, gossip, the clang of tools, and the hum of life that felt endless. The towns were small, but their hearts were loud. Every face was familiar, every rumor a kind of entertainment. On market days, colors spilled across the square, scarlet cloth from Flanders, salt from the coast, baskets of fruit stacked high beside cages of squawking chickens. Housewives bartered in sing-song tones, jesters performed near the fountain, and young lovers lingered behind stalls, pretending to examine apples while stealing glances at one another. It was an age still tethered to faith and superstition, but it carried a simple certainty: tomorrow would look much like today. As the sun reached its height, life slowed. The air shimmered with heat, and people sought shade beneath arches or the cool silence of the church. Stone walls held a comforting chill, candles flickered in stained glass light. The priests spoke softly from the altar, reminding all of God's grace, the eternal order of things. To live, to work, to pray, this was the natural cycle. The world, they believed, was balanced, watched over by heaven. No one yet sensed how thin that balance truly was. Beyond the city gates stretched endless fields and meadows. Shepherds watched their flocks move like white clouds across the hills, and rivers wound through the valleys like silver threads. Villages clung to these waterways, their cottages wreathed in smoke from peat fires. The air was rich with the smell of hay, damp soil, and wood smoke. In the evenings, families gathered by the hearth. Bread was broken, ale poured, stories told of saints and dragons, of kings and miracles. The nights were dark but peaceful, filled with the sound of insects and the low hum of life continuing. For centuries, the world had endured famine, war, and cold, yet people always rebuilt. Hardship was familiar, but it came in cycles, predictable, survivable. The plague that was to come would not follow this pattern. It would not pass like winter or hunger, it would swallow the pattern itself. But for now, there was no fear, only the steady certainty of seasons. The rhythms of the countryside echoed those of the city, though slower, older. In small chapels, peasants prayed for rain or for mercy from taxes. Bells marked the hours, dividing the day between labor and rest. Children ran barefoot through fields, women washed linen in the river, and men repaired fences or tilled soil with worn hands. Everything had purpose, and everything seemed blessed by repetition. The idea that this could all vanish within a single year was unimaginable. In monasteries, monks copied texts by candlelight, their quills scratching gently against parchment. The silence was broken only by the creak of wood or the flutter of a page. They wrote of scripture, of medicine, of philosophy, preserving the knowledge of centuries. One monk, somewhere in England, noted a rumor he had heard from distant traders, something about a sickness in the East, but he did not linger on it. There had always been sicknesses, and the world had always survived them. At night, the cities glowed with lanterns hanging from doorways. Shadows danced on the walls as travelers arrived from distant lands, sailors with salt in their beards, pilgrims carrying relics and stories. They spoke of strange weather, of restless seas, of a darkness that seemed to follow the trade routes. But their words were met with polite curiosity, not fear. People had grown accustomed to tales of disaster told by strangers. The thought that those stories might soon step through their own gates never crossed their minds. The church bells called again for evening prayers. Smoke curled into the twilight sky, carrying the scent of burning wood and roasted meat. Families gathered at long tables, their faces lit by soft firelight. A mother whispered a prayer over her children. A father poured the last of the ale. Outside, a cold wind brushed against the windows, carrying faint echoes from faraway lands, unheard, unnoticed. The stars above shone with quiet indifference, the same as they always had. In that final season before the plague, there was a rare gentleness to the air. The harvest had been good. Markets thrived, songs were sung, and even the poor believed fortune might be turning in their favor. No one could see that fate was holding its breath. It was as though the entire world had reached a moment of perfect stillness, unaware it stood at the edge of ruin. And when the first whispers began to drift in from the ports, rumors of death riding the wind, people laughed softly and crossed themselves. Such things belonged to distant lands. Their own world was safe, anchored in God's grace, bound by habit and faith. But history would remember that calm, not for its peace, but for its cruel beauty, the final quiet heartbeat before everything began to fade. It began not with a scream, but with a whisper, small, uncertain, and easily dismissed. Somewhere along the Mediterranean coast, in the busy harbors of Genoa and Venice, sailors returned from distant voyages with strange stories. They spoke of entire towns in the east falling silent, of markets abandoned, and of bodies stacked like timber along the ports. They said the air itself carried a kind of heaviness, a taste of rot that clung to the lungs. But such tales had been told before, stories of sickness, of God's punishment, of plagues that came and went. People listened, frowned, and turned back to their wine. It was easier to believe that death stayed far away, that the sea swallowed its horrors before they reached home. The merchants, though, knew better. They had seen it. The first ships that arrived in Italy carried not just cargo, but death hidden in their holds. Rats scurried across the planks as the vessels docked, and their fleas carried an invisible terror. Men unloaded goods, silks, spices, wool, unaware that each touch spread something unseen. Within days, fevers broke out among the dockworkers. Black swellings appeared under their arms and around their necks. Some burned with heat and died within hours, their bodies darkening as if bruised by shadow. Others lingered, coughing blood and delirium into their sheets. The rumors that had once been distant now had faces, names, and graves. Word traveled fast along the trade routes. Caravans carried stories faster than wagons carried grain. A pestilence is coming, people whispered in the inns and monasteries along the roads. A sickness from the east, brought by the ships. In the taverns of Paris, pilgrims murmured that it was God's anger for the greed of men. In the marketplaces of England, it became a rumor to frighten children, something that happened somewhere else, to people they'd never meet. Yet every week, new stories arrived. A town gone silent. A port abandoned. Priests dead before they could finish their last prayers. In Avignon, messengers brought word to the papal court. The disease, they said, spread faster than any known illness. Physicians were called, astrologers consulted, and prayers written into the air like desperate spells. Some said the stars had shifted in a way that poisoned the atmosphere. Others claimed earthquakes had released foul vapors from beneath the ground. And always, there were those who said it was sin, that humanity's arrogance had called down God's wrath. Fear needed an explanation, and the world offered 1,000. Sailors who survived their voyages spoke in low voices about what they had seen. They described the ports of Constantinople, where death had become routine, and the bodies were carried out by the hundreds each morning. They spoke of the East, of traders who vanished mid-journey, of cities where the silence was heavier than prayer. The details changed with every retelling, but one thing never did: the sense that something unstoppable was moving closer. By the time the rumors reached Northern Europe, they had taken on the shape of legend. People said the plague could walk like a man, dressed in rags, carrying a black staff that pointed toward its next victim. Some said it appeared as a shadow that entered through windows at night, others that it rode upon the wind itself. No one could agree on what it was, but everyone felt its presence creeping nearer, like a chill that couldn't be escaped. In London, the city gates were still open. Trade ships came and went, their sails heavy with the summer breeze. But among the sailors were whispers now, of a sickness that left no survivors, of ships found adrift with only corpses aboard. When the first cases appeared in the coastal towns of southern England, few believed the cause could be the same as that distant plague. But within weeks, the pattern repeated itself: fever, swelling, blackened skin, and death before dawn. Priests began to speak of repentance in trembling tones. Bells rang more often, not for celebration but for burial. The air filled with the scent of burning herbs and incense as people tried to cleanse what they could not see. Some locked themselves in their homes, trusting only in isolation. Others fled the towns entirely, taking to the countryside in search of clean air and safety. Yet the sickness followed, silent, invisible, relentless. In the cities of France, fear became a second language. People crossed themselves at every cough, avoided the touch of strangers, and watched the skies for omens. Those who could afford to leave fled to the mountains, believing altitude could save them. Monks in their cloisters wrote of the strange calm before the storm, streets too quiet, markets half empty, and the feeling that the air itself was thick with waiting. The plague had not yet arrived in full, but it was already living in their minds. As autumn deepened, the wind carried the stench of burning from distant ports. Cities tried to cleanse themselves by fire, burning refuse, animal carcasses, and even the homes of the sick. The sound of coughing drifted through the alleys at night, and no one dared to open their doors. Cats and dogs disappeared, killed in superstition, accused of spreading the pestilence. People began to mark their homes with charms, branches of juniper, crosses of ash, tokens hung from windows in trembling hope. And still, the rumors grew darker. Travelers arriving from the south told of towns where no one was left alive to bury the dead. They said the ground itself was filled with sickness, that the rivers carried it, that the breath of the dying could travel on the wind. In every story, the plague seemed less like a disease and more like a curse, something ancient and hungry that had awakened from beneath the earth. By the end of that year, there was no more laughter in the ports, no more music from the taverns. Ships lay abandoned in the harbors, their sails torn, their decks silent. Letters stopped coming, trade ceased, and the world began to close in on itself. The whispers that had started as rumors were now cries, warnings shouted into the night. The plague was no longer a story. It had found its way into every dream, every prayer, every corner of the known world. And as the first church bells began to toll for the dead, people finally understood that the whispers had not been lies. They had been prophecies. The bells began to toll at dawn. Their sound was hollow and constant, echoing through the mist as though the air itself had learned to grieve. Each toll marked another soul gone, another family closed behind nailed doors, another name erased from the records of the living. In every city across Europe, the rhythm of daily life was broken. Streets that once rang with the clatter of carts and the cries of merchants now lay still, filled only with the faint rustle of wind moving through the empty stalls. The Black Death had arrived, and it was no longer whispered, it was screamed in silence. In London, the first signs came quietly. A merchant collapsed in the market, clutching his chest, his skin burning hot to the touch. By nightfall, his wife and sons were coughing blood. Within a week, half the street was infected. In Paris, a physician tried to bleed his patients to balance their humors, but the more he bled them, the faster they died. In Florence, priests carried incense through the alleys, waving it desperately as though the smoke could form a wall between themselves and the invisible killer. The scent of burning herbs filled the air, rosemary, sage, lavender, all thought to cleanse the foul vapors that carried death. But nothing helped. The air grew thicker, heavier, until every breath felt like inhaling sorrow itself. The people had many explanations. Some said it was punishment for their sins, that God's anger had taken form and walked among them. Others blamed the alignment of planets, Saturn, Mars, and Jupiter, claiming their union had poisoned the sky. There were those who swore it was witchcraft, or a miasma rising from the swamps. The physicians wore long robes and bird-like masks stuffed with herbs to purify the air, yet even they trembled beneath the leather, their eyes wide behind the glass. They knew deep down that the sickness did not care for reason. It moved like smoke through every home, choosing its victims without pattern or mercy. Everywhere the world grew quieter. Markets closed, inns stood empty, and the sound of laughter vanished. The smell of lime and vinegar replaced that of bread and flowers. Men carried handkerchiefs soaked in perfume, pressing them to their faces as they passed the sick. Some refused to look at the dying at all, believing that even sight could spread the plague. Others turned to desperate rituals, walking barefoot through the streets, whipping themselves bloody in penance, singing hymns through the night as if noise could keep death away. The processions of flagellants became a familiar sight, long lines of men chanting prayers, their backs marked with fresh wounds, their voices hoarse from pleading. They believed suffering would save them. But the plague devoured saints and sinners alike. In the homes of the infected, the fear was unbearable. A child would cough in the night, and a mother's heart would stop with dread. A fevered husband would reach out for comfort, and his wife would flinch away, torn between love and survival. The swellings, those dark, painful lumps, rose beneath the skin like curses made visible. They oozed, they burned, and within days they turned black. The smell of decay seeped from the houses even before the bodies were removed. People spoke of the dead as if they were still listening, afraid that disrespect might call the sickness closer. The priests tried to continue their duties, but soon even the churches became silent. Too many clergy had fallen ill. Those who remained walked through streets filled with the moans of the dying, holding up crucifixes and whispering the last rites from a distance. Graves overflowed, the earth could not swallow fast enough. When there was no more room in the cemeteries, they dug pits, vast, open holes into which bodies were stacked by the hundreds. Men hired to carry the dead moved through the city at dusk, ringing small bells to warn others to keep away. The sound was both a mercy and a curse, for it meant the living were coming to collect the fallen. In towns where the dead carts rolled, the people shut their windows tight and prayed the wheels would not stop at their door. The streets reeked of smoke and fear. Some families locked themselves in, determined to survive by isolation alone, while others fled into the countryside, believing the open air could protect them. But the plague followed wherever they went. Villages that once welcomed travelers began to drive them away with stones and torches. Every stranger was a potential death sentence. The social order collapsed as swiftly as the bodies did. Lords and peasants alike perished side by side. Laws were forgotten. Work stopped. The fields went unharvested, the mills stood still, and hunger joined the list of terrors. The few physicians who still worked charged fortunes for their visits, and even they often refused to enter homes. Death had become a profession. Men who once shod horses now dug graves. Monks who once illuminated holy texts now counted corpses. Night fell differently during those months. The air seemed to vibrate with dread. Fires burned in the streets to cleanse the air, their smoke painting the sky with a dull orange glow. Dogs howled endlessly, drawn by the scent of death. Some said they could hear whispers in the wind, voices calling names that had not yet died. For the first time, people began to question whether God still watched over them at all. Churches once filled with song became hollow shells where the faithful sat in silence, too afraid to touch holy water, too frightened to take communion. The few who dared to travel brought only more fear. Messengers carried news from other cities, news that sounded like prophecy. Florence was dying. Venice was silent. In Paris, the bells never stopped ringing. Every town heard the same story in a different voice, and each believed it was next. The world that had once seemed eternal now felt like it was ending. The routines of centuries, harvests, markets, prayers, were stripped away, replaced by a single obsession, survival. Yet even survival began to lose its meaning. When everyone around you was gone, when streets echoed only with the tolling of death, what was left to live for? The bells that began at dawn sometimes rang until nightfall. No one counted anymore. The sound melted into the air like a heartbeat that refused to stop, reminding all who listened that their turn was coming. And in the stillness between tolls, when the echoes faded and the city seemed to hold its breath, people swore they could hear the footsteps of something unseen, slow, patient, and moving ever closer. They began as desperate improvisations. Ordinary homes turned into places of containment. When the sickness spread beyond control, when every street hid a dying family, the councils of towns and cities sought to impose order upon the chaos. The decree was simple and final. The sick were not to walk among the healthy. Their homes would be sealed, and those within would remain until they recovered or perished. Thus were born the plague houses, grim, makeshift sanctuaries that became tombs before the ink of their orders had dried. No one volunteered their home for such a purpose. Often, the decision was made by strangers, officials who moved through the city wearing cloaks soaked in vinegar, their faces covered. They would mark a door, whisper a prayer, and pass the judgment that condemned those inside to isolation. A cross of red paint was drawn upon the wood, crude and unmistakable. Sometimes it dripped, looking almost like blood. Above it, they scrawled words in trembling strokes, "Lord, have mercy upon us." The sight of that mark froze the heart of every passerby. To live behind such a door was to vanish from the living world. The transformation of a home into a plague house was swift and cruel. Windows were shuttered, nails driven deep into frames, cracks stuffed with cloth to prevent the passage of air. Food was left at the threshold, bread, water, herbs, but no one lingered to see if it was taken. Guards or watchmen were stationed outside to ensure no one escaped. They stood in silence, torches in hand, unwilling to look too long at the walls behind which families waited to die. Inside, rooms once filled with laughter now echoed with coughs and whispers. The walls that had once kept out the cold became their prison. Every town developed its rituals. In London, carts brought straw and lime to scatter before the doors of the infected. In York, entire streets were blocked off with wooden barricades. In small villages, where every face was known, it was the neighbors themselves who sealed one another in, driven by fear but also duty. No one spoke much during these acts. Words had lost their meaning. The hammering of nails was enough. The sound carried through the air like a funeral drumbeat. The plague houses varied in size and misery. In the cities, they were cramped, dark places where the sick were piled together in narrow rooms. In rural villages, they were isolated cottages on the edge of fields, smoke still curling from their chimneys long after the inhabitants were gone. Some were marked by officials, others were left to decay in silence. Dogs barked at their doors but dared not enter. Birds perched on the roofs, sensing the stillness beneath. There were rules written down by the authorities, but they were rarely followed. The intention, at least in words, was mercy, to contain the sickness, to give the infected a chance to recover. But those locked inside knew what it truly meant. Few ever emerged alive. Some families tried to comfort themselves with prayer, others with denial. They sang hymns softly, their voices trembling, or told stories to children who no longer had the strength to stand. As days turned into weeks, the world outside became a distant echo. The red cross on their door was both a warning and a gravestone. For the watchmen, the plague houses were nightmares made routine. They were tasked with guarding the living dead, ensuring no escape, no breach of order. Each morning they listened for signs from within, sometimes the faint murmur of voices, sometimes nothing at all. When silence lasted too long, they sent word to the collectors of the dead. The door would then be unsealed, only for the bodies to be carried away and the house burned or boarded again. The watchmen drank to forget the sounds they heard at night. The pleading through the cracks, the scratching at the walls, the whispered promises of gold in exchange for a single hour of freedom. Most refused to look at the faces of those who begged. They could not afford to remember them. In larger towns, whole districts were converted into quarantine zones. Streets of crimson-marked doors lined up like a gallery of despair. The rich fled before their own doors could be painted, escaping to country estates or to ships that sailed for cleaner ports. The poor had no such refuge. Their houses became the city's sacrifice. Priests walked these streets only at dusk, their shadows stretching long as they murmured blessings through the cracks. The prayers often ended mid-sentence, swallowed by the sound of coughing behind the doors. Some plague houses became infamous. There were stories of one in Florence where a mother kept the bodies of her 3 children beside her, unwilling to let them be taken. In another, near York, the last survivor, a young man, was found weeks later, sitting beside the ashes of his burned companions, whispering to no one. These tales spread quickly, carried by rumor and fear, until the phrase, plague house, no longer meant a building, but a feeling, a symbol of despair, isolation, and divine judgment. Yet even amid this horror, there were acts of kindness. A few brave souls, neighbors, nuns, or strangers, left food, letters, or flowers near the thresholds. Some whispered prayers outside the doors each morning, refusing to let the forgotten be entirely erased. One account tells of a woman who played her lute each evening outside the sealed home of her sister, believing the sound might bring her comfort. She played until the music stopped being answered, and then she kept playing anyway, for the dead. The smell of the plague houses lingered long after the sickness inside had burned itself out. When they were finally opened, the air within was thick and stale, the silence immense. Furniture remained untouched, meals half-eaten, candles melted into strange shapes. On the walls, some had left messages, scratched into plaster or written in soot. "We are not forgotten. God forgive us. Mercy, Lord, mercy." These words survived longer than the people who wrote them. By the time the worst of the plague began to fade, thousands of plague houses stood empty, their windows dark and broken. Grass grew in their doorways, ivy crept along their stones. Many were abandoned completely, believed to be cursed. Travelers crossed themselves when passing by, children dared each other to touch their walls, and even the bravest watchmen avoided them once their duty was done. They became scars on the landscape, mute reminders of the nights when entire families vanished behind painted doors. And yet, within those walls, the story of humanity endured. Fear had built those houses, but love often kept the doors shut from within. Mothers tending to the sick, brothers refusing to leave their sisters, husbands lying beside their dying wives. In the midst of the plague's cruelty, there was something profoundly human about these sealed places. They were prisons, yes, but also sanctuaries of devotion, where people faced death not as strangers, but as families. When the bells tolled again, marking another morning of loss, the red crosses gleamed faintly in the dawn light. The wind moved softly through the empty streets, carrying the scent of smoke and lime. The city held its breath, and for a fleeting moment, the world seemed to pause, caught between life and silence, between faith and fear. And behind those crimson doors, countless stories ended quietly, unheard but not forgotten. Inside the sealed houses, time lost all meaning. Morning and night became indistinguishable, the light from the shuttered windows barely strong enough to mark the hours. The air grew heavy, the stench of sickness mingling with the damp of confinement. Every breath was a gamble, every cough a death sentence whispered in the dark. Families huddled together, wrapped in blankets that no longer gave warmth. Some prayed, some sang softly to drive away the silence, but most simply waited for either recovery or the sound of the death cart outside. There was no distinction anymore between the living and the dying, only degrees of weakness, of fever, of despair. The sickness moved through the household like a shadow that touched one after another. It began with heat in the skin, a burning that no water could quench. Then came the swellings, black and red lumps that rose beneath the arms and between the legs, buboes, they were called. They throbbed like a second heartbeat, a cruel reminder that life itself was turning against the body. Victims spoke of a taste of iron in the mouth, of visions in the corners of their sight, of dreams filled with fire and smoke. When the swellings burst, the air filled with the sour scent of decay. The survivors in the room turned their faces away, ashamed of their relief that it was not yet their turn. Those who tended the sick had little to protect them. They used vinegar-soaked rags for masks, clutched burning herbs to cleanse the air, prayed over bowls of smoke. Mothers cleaned their children's sores with trembling hands, knowing the touch might bring the same fate. Husbands watched their wives fade and still refused to leave their sides. In the flickering candlelight, sweat glistened on pale faces, and whispers of forgiveness mingled with delirious muttering. The sound of weeping never fully ceased, it simply changed voices as the days passed. Water became precious. The watchmen outside sometimes left buckets at the door, but often they forgot or feared to come near. Families rationed what little they had, sharing cups between lips cracked and fevered. Food rotted untouched. Rats scurried along the floors, bold now that humans barely moved. In some homes, the rats themselves were the first to die, their bodies curled beside the hearth, a grim sign that death had claimed even the smallest lives. At night, the houses became worlds unto themselves. The sound of bells from the city, tolling for the dead, seemed distant and unreal. Sometimes the silence was broken by cries for help, voices calling through the cracks, begging the watchman to open the door, to send a priest, to bring light. No one answered. The rules were absolute: no entry, no escape. To open a plague house was to invite the plague itself into the streets again. And so the cries went unanswered until they stopped altogether. The guards outside marked the silence on their lists, and the cartmen came the next morning to carry the bodies away. There were stories of strange visions seen by the dying. Some spoke of angels walking through the rooms, their wings made of ash. Others swore they saw black dogs watching from the shadows, their eyes glinting like embers. The fevered mind could not tell what was real anymore. To the survivors, these tales were both comfort and curse. If angels truly came, perhaps they came for mercy, but if the dogs were real, they were said to be omens of damnation, sent to collect souls too afraid to die. The lines between faith and fear blurred completely. Sometimes, the dead were not immediately removed. The cartmen could not come every day, and the watchmen were too frightened to enter. Families were left to live beside the bodies of their loved ones, covering them with blankets or moving them to corners. In one recorded account, a man wrote that he had to share his bed with the corpse of his brother for 2 nights before the door was opened. He was cold, the man wrote, but I kept speaking to him as if my voice might bring him back. That entry ends abruptly. Historians believe the writer did not live to finish it. The youngest suffered the most quietly. Children too weak to understand, too scared to sleep alone, clung to their parents even as fever took them. Mothers told stories to keep them calm, tales of saints, of stars, of better days. One mother in a London plague house reportedly sang each night until her voice gave out. When the watchmen finally entered, they found her sitting upright, her arms around her 2 children, all 3 still and silent. The candle beside her had burned down to the wax and gone cold. There were moments of grim resilience too. Some survivors scrawled notes on the walls, keeping track of days or offering warnings to anyone who might one day enter. "Keep to prayer," one message read. Another said, "Light was here." In a few rare cases, people did recover. They emerged pale, trembling, their clothes hanging loose on their bones, but alive. The watchmen sometimes refused to open the doors even for them, fearing the disease still lingered. Those who managed to escape often found that their neighbors had fled, their names forgotten, their homes marked forever by the Red Cross. The worst suffering was not always the disease itself, but the isolation. To die alone, unheard, unburied, it was the fate most feared in medieval life. Funerals were sacred, communal rituals, but the plague denied that final grace. Instead, the bodies were carried at night, piled onto carts, and buried in great pits beyond the city walls. No names, no prayers, just the dull sound of earth falling over the dead. Those who remained behind could only imagine the faces of those buried together, family beside stranger, child beside beggar. By the 3rd week of isolation, madness often set in. Some tore at the walls, others raved at invisible shapes. The sound of flies filled the rooms, their constant hum a mockery of life. In one account, a priest described visiting the outside of a plague house to administer last rites through the door. He heard laughter from within, a high, unending laughter that chilled him more than the silence of the dead. He fled without finishing the prayer, convinced the devil himself had taken residence there. When the door was finally opened, days or weeks later, the air inside struck like a blow. The stench of death, the heat of decay, the silence of what remained, it was unbearable. The watchers held cloths to their faces and entered cautiously, moving through rooms where time had stopped. In one corner, a table was still set for supper. In another, a Bible lay open to the book of Psalms. Sometimes a single candle remained upright, its wick long extinguished. The scenes were both intimate and horrific, like echoes of a life suddenly interrupted. Each plague house revealed its own story in the aftermath, told not in words but in the arrangement of objects, the positioning of bodies, the faint marks of hands on the walls. The chroniclers who recorded these sites often wrote with trembling hands, their entries short and haunted. They tried to make sense of what they saw, but the truth was beyond reason. The world outside the plague houses had become unrecognizable. Streets once bustling with merchants and laughter were now hollow corridors echoing with the wheels of death carts. The sound of their wooden rims grinding against the cobblestones was the heartbeat of a dying city. "Bring out your dead," the carters cried, their voices hoarse from repetition, carrying through alleys and marketplaces alike. No one met their eyes. No one wanted to see the faces of those who collected what remained of families and neighbors. The carts stopped at the doors marked with red crosses, and sometimes a gloved hand would toss out a body wrapped in linen, sometimes two, sometimes an entire household. The carters did not pause to count. They moved on, leaving behind a silence more terrible than their calls. The men who drove those carts were not chosen. They were condemned. Criminals, drunks, the desperate poor, men with nothing left to lose. The job paid a few coins, and the reward for survival was often madness. They moved through the city like phantoms, their faces covered in vinegar-soaked rags, their eyes glazed and hollow. The smell of rot clung to them even after washing. Children whispered that death itself followed in their footsteps. Some drank constantly just to bear it. Others began to speak to the bodies they carried, murmuring apologies or prayers, as if trying to make peace with the souls they transported to their final rest. Each night, when the bells tolled, the carts gathered at the edge of the city where the plague pits waited. They were vast, open graves, trenches dug in haste, deep enough to hold hundreds. No priest could bless them fast enough, no shroud could cover them all. The carters tipped the bodies in like logs into a fire, layer upon layer, dusted with lime to mask the stench. Sometimes the dead were still warm, sometimes they were not yet dead at all. Witnesses told of faint cries from beneath the heaps, the twitching of limbs, the flutter of fingers before the next load fell. Those stories were whispered, never written down, for no one wanted to believe them. Yet in the silence of night, even the bravest men swore they heard voices rising from beneath the earth. The pits were the final destination for countless lives that no longer had names. The poor, the rich who couldn't flee in time, the priests who stayed too long, the children who never learned what was happening, all thrown together, stripped of identity. The earth itself seemed to reject them. After heavy rain, bones surfaced again, pale and clean under the moonlight. The ground breathed death back into the air, and people began to avoid even the land itself. Fields near the pits were abandoned. Grass grew tall, but no one dared cut it. Travelers hurried past, crossing themselves. Some said the wind over the burial grounds carried whispers, like prayers half-spoken and left unfinished. Those who survived tried to maintain order, but the rules of life no longer held meaning. The watchmen stopped enforcing the curfews when there were too few to watch. The physicians, their masks stuffed with herbs, worked in silence, knowing their remedies did nothing. Streets were washed with vinegar, fires burned in barrels to purify the air, yet the invisible enemy moved as it pleased. The city's leaders fled or locked themselves inside their manors, their proclamations echoing in streets too empty to hear them. For those left behind, survival was no longer about medicine or wealth. It was about endurance, how long a soul could endure the sound of its own heart beating in a dead world. In the dead of night, when the carts had finished their rounds and the last bell had fallen silent, another kind of activity began. Thieves and scavengers crept into the plague houses, drawn by greed or madness. They believed the dying could not guard their treasures, and they were right, but the cost was steep. Many of these grave robbers never emerged again, claimed by the sickness or by something stranger still. There were tales of shadows moving inside the sealed homes, of whispers that called thieves by name, of doors that would not open once closed behind them. Some said the spirits of the dead defended their own, unwilling to let the living profit from their suffering. The next day, the watchmen would find the thieves' bodies among the others, their faces twisted in terror, their hands clutching at invisible throats. Not all who entered the plague houses came for gold. There were those who came for love or faith. Priests, driven by duty, risked their lives to administer the last rites through shuttered windows or cracks in the door. They carried wooden crucifixes, trembling as they spoke the words of absolution into the darkness beyond. Some caught the sickness within days, their courage rewarded only with death. Others survived, but they were never the same. One monk wrote in his journal that he felt the presence of God not in the churches, but in the plague houses themselves, in the trembling breath of those who refused to die quietly. I saw, he wrote, in the eyes of the dying not despair, but something holy, something beyond suffering. There were moments when humanity flickered even in the depths of horror. Neighbors who risked everything to pass food through cracks in the walls. Children who left wildflowers outside doors marked for death. Women who volunteered to care for strangers, believing that charity might save their souls even if it cost their lives. Some of these acts went unseen, others became legend. One story tells of a young woman named and who stayed behind after her entire street was evacuated. She tended to 12 plague victims alone, nursing them with herbs and prayers. 11 died, but one survived, and later he built a chapel in her memory. History forgot the names of kings from that year, but N's chapel still stands. Still, the majority of the city remained in darkness. Smoke hung over rooftops, the sky tinted gray from the constant burning of infected homes and belongings. The bell towers never stopped tolling. Each peal was a farewell, a ritual stripped of ceremony. The priests grew too weary to recite the rites. They began to say them in groups, one prayer for 10 souls, then 50, then 100. May God have mercy, they whispered, again and again, until even the words felt hollow. Those who dared to look beyond the city walls saw the landscape transformed. Farmlands lay untended, sheep wandered free, and villages stood empty. The roads were littered with abandoned wagons, with shoes, with letters that never reached their destinations. The world seemed to have paused, suspended between one breath and the next. Even nature grew quiet. The birds no longer sang over the city. Only the crows remained, gathering on rooftops, their cries echoing like laughter. Amidst it all, there was one constant, the sound of the death carts. They moved like the tide, steady, relentless, indifferent. The people learned to live by that rhythm, counting their days not in sunrises, but in how many times they heard the carters pass. When the wheels stop, an old woman said, the plague will end. When the plague finally loosened its grip, it did not depart with thunder or triumph. There was no single day of deliverance, no grand moment when bells rang for joy. Instead, it faded like a shadow retreating from the morning light, slowly, almost reluctantly, leaving behind a world too exhausted to celebrate. Those who survived emerged from their houses as if waking from a nightmare that had lasted an eternity. They were pale, hollow-eyed, thinner than memory itself. The sun felt foreign on their skin. Streets once filled with death carts now lay still, the silence thick enough to make even birds hesitate before singing. The survivors walked through cities that no longer belonged to them. Every street carried the scent of ashes and vinegar, every wall still marked with the faded ghosts of red crosses. Doors hung crooked on their hinges, windows were shattered or sealed with rotting planks. In some houses, the air inside had not been disturbed for months, and the first breeze through them brought forth the stench of death like a buried secret uncovered. The plague had passed, but its memory clung to every stone. Even the winds seemed different, heavier, slower, as if mourning. In London, Florence, Paris, and countless smaller towns, the same scenes played out. Grass grew through cracks in the cobblestones, reclaiming ground where no foot had stepped for weeks. Churches opened their doors again, but the pews were nearly empty. The priests who remained performed mass for congregations of survivors who no longer dared to sit close to one another. The old gestures of community, handshakes, embraces, shared bread, had become frightening. People flinched at touch. When they spoke, they did so softly, as if afraid their voices might stir the plague from its slumber. The bells that had once tolled for the dead now rang timidly for the living. Yet their sound, meant for comfort, brought tears instead. The survivors knew the names behind every peal. Some stood outside the churches without entering, heads bowed, unable to face the altar that had witnessed so many last prayers. Even those who had kept their faith found themselves changed. They no longer asked why the plague had come, they asked only why they had been spared. The answers, if any existed, were too fragile to hold. As the days stretched into weeks, the cities began to stir again. Markets reopened, though the sellers were few. The air filled once more with the faint sounds of trade, but laughter was slow to return. The survivors moved carefully, speaking of before and after, as if they were two different lifetimes. Those who had lost everything, homes, families, futures, wandered the streets in silence, staring at the places where loved ones once stood. There were fewer children now. Their absence was the loudest silence of all. Where once their laughter had echoed in alleys, now only the wind played through broken shutters. The grave pits outside the cities became uneasy landmarks. Grass eventually covered them, but no one could forget what lay beneath. Travelers avoided them, and when new houses were built, they were never placed near those fields. Sometimes, after rain, the soil shifted and bones surfaced again, small white fragments gleaming through the mud like moonlight. People whispered that the earth itself was trying to remember. At night, some claimed to see pale shapes moving across the fields, as though the dead still walked in quiet processions. Whether born of grief or guilt, these visions became part of the landscape. In many towns, the first task of the survivors was cleansing. Fires were lit to burn infected bedding, clothing, and furniture. Smoke curled into the sky for days, gray and steady, marking the ritual of purification. Physicians recommended fumigation with herbs, rosemary, sage, lavender, until the streets smelled less like decay and more like morning masked in sweetness. The lime pits were refilled, the watchmen dismissed, and the doors of plague houses were finally opened. Some of those doors had not moved in months, and when they did, the hinges screamed like living things. Inside, time had stopped. Tables were still set for meals that had never been eaten, candles melted into frozen rivers of wax, letters left unfinished beside dry ink pots. It was as though death had paused mid-breath and left everything as it was. The process of reclaiming life was slow, uncertain, and deeply haunted. For every survivor, there was a memory too painful to speak aloud. Some refused to return to their former homes, unable to cross the thresholds where entire families had vanished. Others stayed, determined to restore what had been lost. They scrubbed walls, washed floors, rethatched roofs, but no amount of cleaning could erase the feeling that something unseen still lingered. The plague had infected not only bodies, but the very soul of the world. The rulers who had fled returned cautiously, issuing proclamations of recovery, promising renewal. They spoke of rebuilding markets, repopulating towns, planting crops once more. But their words fell flat. The people had seen too much, learned too well how fragile authority was. Power had meant nothing against the plague. The true leaders in those dark months had been the nameless, the watchmen, the grave diggers, the women who nursed strangers, the priests who stayed behind. History rarely recorded their names, but in whispered stories, they became saints of the forgotten. Artists and writers tried to make sense of what had happened. Chroniclers filled pages with numbers of the dead, lists of streets emptied, villages erased. Painters depicted skeletons dancing with the living, the dance of death, a grim reminder that no one, no matter their rank, could escape mortality. These images spread across Europe, etched into wood and memory alike. They were warnings, but also reflections of truth, that life and death were forever entwined, and that the plague had only made that bond visible. Even nature seemed altered in the aftermath. Birds returned to the skies, but their songs sounded different, as if the world itself had learned sorrow. The seasons felt slower, more deliberate. Fields once abandoned began to bloom again, though in strange colors where lime had seeped into the soil. Livestock grazed in silence, unbothered by the ruins around them. Humanity had thinned, but the earth endured. Some took that as a sign of hope, others as an accusation, that life beyond human life would always continue, indifferent to suffering. As time passed, the survivors began to tell stories, quietly at first, then more openly. Parents spoke of the plague to their children as a warning, a lesson in humility. Tales of the red crosses, of the watchmen, of the carts and the pits, were passed down like folklore. Yet these stories changed with each retelling. The horror softened, became myth. Some said angels had walked among the plague houses. Others claimed that certain bells still rang at night when the wind was right, tolling for souls who had never been given proper rest. Truth dissolved into memory, and memory into legend. And yet, beneath all that legend, something real endured. Even as the plague receded and the scars of its passing began to fade from the earth, the deeper wounds remained, etched not in stone or record, but in the hearts of those who had endured it. The survivors found themselves haunted by what they had seen, and by what they had done to survive. Night after night, they dreamed of red crosses, of muffled cries behind boarded doors, of faces pressed against windows that would never open again. In those dreams, time folded back upon itself, and the plague returned, not as a sickness, but as a shadow that lived inside memory. The human mind, unable to grasp the scale of loss, sought meaning in it. Priests spoke of divine punishment, of sin and cleansing. They told the people that God had turned his face away, that humanity had been humbled so that it might remember its dependence on heaven. But others, especially those who had buried too many children or seen too many priests fall ill, began to question. If this was divine will, they asked, why had it spared the cruel and taken the kind? Why had monasteries, built in prayer and devotion, fallen silent? Why had the holy men died beside the beggars in the same unmarked graves? The certainty that had once guided faith was broken, replaced by doubt as heavy as the silence after a bell stops ringing. Many could no longer bring themselves to enter churches. The scent of incense reminded them of the dead. The hymns, once comforting, now sounded like laments. In some towns, the congregations dwindled until only the clergy remained, muttering prayers to empty pews. The survivors found their faith elsewhere, in the open sky, in the feel of soil between their fingers, in the fragile persistence of dawn after endless nights. Some began to believe that the plague had not been sent by heaven or hell, but by nature itself, an act of balance, not vengeance. Such thoughts were whispered carefully, for they bordered on heresy, yet they spread quietly among the people, planting the first seeds of a new way of thinking, one less bound to fear and more to observation. Still, the fear of recurrence never vanished. Each cough, each fever, each swelling of the skin brought waves of panic. Markets emptied at the first rumor of sickness, and travelers were met with suspicion wherever they went. The red crosses had faded from the doors, but their memory remained bright in the collective mind. Children born after the plague grew up hearing the stories, half warning, half myth, and even they felt a tremor of dread when the church bells rang unexpectedly. The idea of contagion, invisible and merciless, had entered human understanding forever. The cities rebuilt slowly, and with them came new laws, new customs shaped by terror. Quarantines were established, strict and unquestioned. Ships arriving in harbor were held offshore for 40 days, quarantagiorni, the word that would become quarantine. Town councils appointed physicians to watch for early signs of disease, and isolation wards were built on the outskirts, far from the crowded streets. No one spoke of plague houses anymore, but everyone knew their purpose. It was a lesson learned in agony, containment through separation. Yet beneath the practicality lay something deeper, a wound disguised as precaution, a fear of touch that would echo through centuries. Those who studied the plague began to emerge as a new kind of thinker. They were not priests, nor purely physicians, but observers, men who sought patterns in death rather than omens. They recorded symptoms, mapped its spread, dissected cause and consequence. Though their tools were crude, their courage was remarkable. They walked where others would not, stared directly into the abyss of decay, and dared to ask why. Their notes, preserved through time, would one day form the earliest understanding of epidemic and immunity. But at the time, their work was as dangerous as the disease itself. Some were accused of witchcraft or blasphemy, for to question divine will was to challenge the order of the world. Still, they persisted, their curiosity stronger than fear. For the common people, survival brought guilt. They had lived when so many had not, and that simple fact became a burden. Mothers who buried their children could not bring themselves to smile again. Husbands who had fled in panic from infected wives carried that shame until death. Those who had profited, the merchants who raised prices, the gravediggers who grew rich on tragedy, found themselves shunned long after the danger had passed. The plague had not only killed, it had revealed. It showed what humanity was capable of in desperation, both cruel and kind, selfish and sacrificial. Some learned compassion from it. Others never spoke of it again, preferring silence to remembrance. Years passed, but the signs of the plague remained in the very architecture of cities. Narrow alleys were widened to let the wind pass through more freely. Wells were covered to prevent contamination. Cemeteries expanded far beyond their former walls. Artists began to carve skulls into monuments, not merely as memento mori but as symbols of shared survival. The image of death had been stripped of its mystery. It had become familiar, almost domestic. Children played near charnel grounds, and no one flinched. The plague had made mortality part of daily life. In some places, small rituals developed to keep the memory at bay. Families left offerings at crossroads where plague pits had once been dug: flowers, bread, candles. On the anniversaries of the worst outbreaks, people stayed indoors voluntarily, lighting a single candle in their windows. These customs had no official blessing, no scripture behind them, but they offered comfort. They were acts of quiet defiance against forgetting. To remember the plague was painful, but to forget it felt like inviting it to return. And yet, as generations turned, memory softened. The sharp edges of grief dulled into legend. The plague became a story told to frighten children into obedience, or a symbol of divine wrath used in sermons. The human mind, always seeking distance from pain, wrapped it in myth. The reality, the smell, the screams, the loneliness, faded from the living world. The red crosses became symbols in paintings. The plague doctors with their beaked masks became curiosities in manuscripts. What had once been unendurable became history. But for those few who had seen it with their own eyes, who had watched entire streets vanish in silence, the plague was never history. It was a ghost that lingered at the edge of every quiet evening. An old woman stirring a pot would pause, thinking she heard the faint creak of a cart. A man walking home at dusk might glimpse a flicker of red paint on a wall and feel his breath catch. For them, the past was never truly gone. It waited patiently, like dust in sunlight, ready to rise again if disturbed. When the next outbreaks came, as they inevitably did, humanity was both more prepared and more afraid. The lessons of the medieval plague houses had been written not in ink, but in instinct. At the first signs of illness, people sealed themselves inside, repeating the old rituals of isolation. They painted signs anew, built barriers, burned herbs, and whispered the same desperate prayers. The centuries that followed brought with them progress, cleaner streets, greater knowledge, laws born from suffering, but the shadows of the plague never fully vanished. They lingered in the corners of human thought, shaping how people viewed life, death, and each other. Those who had survived passed down not just stories, but instincts. To wash one's hands before eating. To keep distance from the ill. To bury the dead quickly and respectfully. What had once been desperate superstition became the foundation of public health. The plague houses, though long abandoned, had left behind an invisible inheritance, a vigilance etched into the collective memory of humankind. When merchants reopened their shops and towns began to trade once more, the rhythms of life returned, yet they beat to a slower, more cautious drum. In marketplaces, people no longer pressed shoulder to shoulder as they once had. Conversation drifted through the air, softer, measured, almost reverent. Each life had become precious, every face a fragile miracle. The laughter that once filled taverns now carried an edge of disbelief, as if joy itself was a rebellion against all that had been lost. Music played again, but even its melodies carried traces of mourning. The instruments were the same, yet the hands that played them had been changed by grief. The rebuilding of society was not only physical, it was spiritual. People sought to understand what the plague had meant, to draw lessons from its cruelty. Chroniclers recorded its horrors so that no one might forget. They described the red crosses, the death carts, the priests who sang in empty streets. But in their writing there was also something else. For all its devastation, the plague had revealed the sheer persistence of life. Against a force that seemed unstoppable, humanity had endured. And from that endurance grew a strange kind of faith, not in miracles or divine intervention, but in the quiet strength of survival itself. In the years that followed, Europe changed in ways no one could have foreseen. The old hierarchies began to crumble. With so many dead, land became cheap, labor valuable. Serfs demanded wages, and lords, weakened by loss, had little choice but to grant them. Out of the ashes of the plague rose the first whispers of social mobility. The rigid order of medieval life began to shift, not through rebellion, but through necessity. It was as if the plague had shaken the chessboard of society, scattering pieces that had been fixed for centuries. When they settled again, the world was no longer the same. Art, too, transformed. Painters no longer filled their canvases only with saints and kings. They painted skeletons dancing beside peasants, death walking among the living as an equal. This motif, the danse macabre, spread across Europe, a haunting reflection of a universal truth. Death had spared no one, and in that equality, people found a strange form of comfort. The wealthy and the poor, the holy and the sinful, all had been humbled beneath the same scythe. For the first time, art spoke to everyone. It did not glorify power, it revealed vulnerability. The plague had democratized mortality, and with it, art itself. Writers and thinkers began to emerge who questioned everything that had once been taken for granted. They asked whether disease truly came from God, or whether it followed laws of nature that might one day be understood. The seeds of the Renaissance, curiosity, observation, reason, were sown in soil watered by the blood of plague victims. From the despair of the plague houses came a new kind of courage, the courage to question. It was fragile at first, whispered in private rooms, written in coded journals, but it grew. Slowly, Europe began to awaken from its long medieval sleep. Even the Church, unshakable for so long, could not remain unchanged. The faith of its followers had been tested beyond endurance. Many priests had fled their parishes, others had died serving them. The survivors looked to the heavens and found silence. In that silence, a quiet rebellion took root, a belief that holiness might exist outside stone walls and stained glass. The idea that an individual could seek truth through personal experience, not through authority, began to spread. The Reformation, centuries later, would trace part of its lineage back to the doubts born in plague years. For the common people, the memory of the plague remained a ghost that guided their every choice. In villages, children grew up hearing the stories of what their ancestors had endured. They were taught to fear crowded places, to pray for good air, to listen when the wind changed. Mothers scolded their children for playing too close to strangers. Fathers taught them to respect the graves outside town. Festivals returned, but always with an undercurrent of caution, joy mixed with remembrance. Life had become a balance between celebration and survival, as if the world had learned to dance on the edge of a grave. And yet, for all its terror, the plague had done what centuries of sermons could not. It had reminded humanity of its shared frailty. The walls that had once divided rich from poor, noble from peasant, were momentarily dissolved. Death had been the great equalizer, and though the living rebuilt their divisions soon enough, something of that awareness endured. It could be seen in the charitable hospitals that began to appear, in the physicians who offered their skills freely to the sick, in the laws that sought to protect not just the powerful, but the weak. Compassion, born from tragedy, became part of the social fabric. Still, the fear never fully left. Every generation that followed carried traces of inherited dread. When the next illnesses came, the sweating sickness, the influenza, the cholera outbreaks, people reached instinctively for the old rituals, the burning herbs, the closed doors, the painted symbols of warning. The plague had taught the world to expect catastrophe, and in doing so, had made it more resilient. Knowledge had replaced panic, but memory remained, a shadow behind the progress. By the dawn of the modern age, the plague was no longer an immediate threat, but it lived on in the architecture of cities, the structure of laws, and the psyche of humankind. The isolation hospitals, the quarantines, the idea of sanitation, all were the descendants of that medieval terror. The world had rebuilt itself upon the bones of its own history, stronger perhaps, but never entirely healed. Because deep within the collective mind, there lingered the understanding that safety was an illusion, that behind every crowded market, every joyous festival, there waited the possibility of another unseen enemy. And so, the story of the plague houses was never truly finished. Though the walls had crumbled and the grass had grown over their foundations, their memory remained alive, like a quiet warning whispered through time. Humanity had learned to survive, to rebuild, to thrive, but also to remember. For memory was the only shield strong enough to stand between the living and the return of darkness. In that remembrance lay both sorrow and wisdom, a reminder that every age of light carries within it the seed of shadow, and that only through awareness can the cycle ever truly be broken. Time has a way of smoothing over the jagged edges of fear. The centuries that followed the last great northern storms brought calm seas and forgetful hearts. The legend of the Berserker became a story once more, retold in classrooms and documentaries, stripped of its terror and divinity. It was easier to believe that rage and gods and immortality were merely metaphors for the human struggle against chaos. Yet beneath the surface of things, beneath the waters, beneath history itself, some truths continued to stir, unseen and unbound. In 2087, the world had become one of precision and control. Satellites mapped every cloud, and oceans were scanned for resources rather than secrets. Yet one region refused to cooperate, the Old North Sea, near the coordinates long associated with what scientists still called the Berserker frequency. A government-funded research project, led by physicist Dr. Cora Lindholm, was established to uncover the cause of these recurring electromagnetic pulses. Most dismissed them as tectonic noise or the interference of deep-sea cables. But Cora was not most scientists. She had grown up on the rugged coasts of Norway, where her grandmother told stories by firelight of the undying warrior who could not die because the world itself remembered him. She never believed those tales, not really, but when her instruments began to record pulses in rhythmic intervals, pulses that perfectly mirrored the human heartbeat, something inside her shifted. The deeper they probed, the stranger it became. The signals responded to human presence, strengthening whenever someone focused on them, weakening when attention waned. It was as though something vast and ancient was aware, listening from below. The readings came not from a single point, but from a structure miles wide, hidden beneath sediment and shifting currents. Cora and her team deployed an autonomous drone to explore the anomaly. As it descended, sonar revealed a circular pattern embedded deep within the seabed, perfectly symmetrical, with intricate spirals radiating outward like veins of light. The drone's camera captured brief flashes of metallic reflection, followed by static. When the feed stabilized, the image froze on something impossible, a vast rune, carved in stone, glowing faintly through the silt. The same symbol recorded centuries earlier by Elias Bergstrom and, before him, by Dr. Ingrid Solheim. The data transmission cut out as a low hum vibrated through the ship. The crew's equipment overloaded, lights flickered, and every compass on board spun out of control. Then came the storm, not from the sky, but from below. The sea began to churn violently, rising in unnatural swells that defied gravity. Waves moved in spirals, forming a vortex of water and light. Cora clutched the railing, eyes wide as she felt the hum through her bones, through her teeth. It wasn't mere vibration, it was rhythm. It was breath. It was the pulse of something alive. The crew scrambled to stabilize the vessel, but every machine failed at once. Monitors glowed white, and a voice, low, ancient, yet unmistakably human, broke through the static. The storm is memory. The fire is inheritance. The words reverberated through the air like thunder, and then, just as suddenly, everything went silent. The sea flattened, eerily still. Not a single wave, not a single gust of wind. Only quiet, dense and absolute. Cora, trembling, activated a manual signal relay. She spoke softly into the transmitter, her voice steady despite the terror in her chest. "If something is there," she whispered, "if you can hear me, what are you?" The silence held for a moment, long enough for her to doubt her own sanity. Then the static answered, not with words, but with sound. A faint, rhythmic beat. Thump, thump, thump. A human heartbeat echoing through the machinery. The pulse grew louder, syncing with her own. Her hands began to tremble as light flickered beneath the waves, spiraling upward, forming patterns that mirrored the neural frequencies of the human brain. Her instruments were no longer reading electromagnetic data, they were reading thought. The berserker wasn't a ghost, a god, or a man trapped in eternity. He had become something else, a consciousness woven into the rhythm of the world itself. Cora realized then that the old stories weren't about war or vengeance. They were about transformation. Bjorn's rage had been so powerful that it outlived flesh, burning into the fabric of creation. He was no longer a man, but a resonance, a reminder of what humanity becomes when it refuses to yield. The sea had carried his memory for 1,000 years, waiting for a world quiet enough to hear him again. And now, through the hum of machines, he was awake. The light expanded, enveloping the vessel in a halo of gold and silver. The crew shouted as instruments overloaded, but Cora stood unmoving, her eyes fixed on the rising spiral. She understood what was happening. The berserker's essence was not reaching out to destroy, it was reaching out to connect. To merge with the only force powerful enough to contain it, consciousness. She felt the warmth spread through her, her heartbeat slowing, syncing perfectly with the rhythm of the storm. For the first time, she felt peace. The storm consumed them whole. Satellites lost contact, and every trace of the expedition vanished from records. But days later, a single transmission surfaced, a fragment of data buried in the global network. It contained no coordinates, no video, no voice. Only a pattern. The same spiral, glowing faintly, repeating endlessly, encoded with the pulse of a human heart. Scientists dismissed it as corrupted data, but a few listeners, those who truly paid attention, swore they heard something beneath the static, a whisper, calm and distant, saying, "Remember the fire." Years passed and the world moved on. But in moments of deep silence, when storms gather far out at sea and the wind shifts just right, a faint hum can still be heard beneath the surface of the world. Some call it a frequency, others a myth reborn through machines. Yet for those who know the old sagas, it is something else entirely. A heartbeat, eternal and patient, waiting for the next soul strong enough to hear it. Because rage fades and gods fall silent, but the memory of defiance, the fire that refuses to die, remains forever. Long after the vanishing of Dr. Cora Lindholm's expedition, the world had entered an age of cold precision. Artificial intelligence governed the tides, satellite arrays mapped every breath of the planet, and humanity had traded mystery for mastery. The ocean was no longer a place of myth but a resource, a field of data points and quantifiable depths. Yet, even in this age of control, there were things that would not stay silent. Beneath the digital hum of the world, the berserker frequency endured, subtle, rhythmic, alive. Most dismissed it as background noise, a relic of outdated sensors, but there were some who listened deeper. In 2149, aboard the orbital research station Aurora's Veil, astrophysicist Dr. Elian Svensson detected a strange pattern in the station's communications array. It was faint, almost imperceptible, a pulse hidden within the electromagnetic spectrum. At first, he thought it was interference caused by cosmic radiation. But the more he filtered the signal, the clearer it became. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. A precise rhythm repeating in intervals of 9 seconds, matching the beat of a human heart under deep rest. The frequency came not from space, but from Earth, from the same coordinates in the North Sea that had haunted history for centuries. He knew the legends, of course. Everyone did. The story of the undying Viking who had become one with the storm had long since transformed into a global myth, retold in films, art, and digital archives. Yet something in this signal felt different, less like a myth being remembered and more like a presence returning. Elian began to decode it, layer by layer, until he realized that embedded within the pulse was structure, harmonic variations that resembled neural patterns. Brainwaves. Something down there was thinking. He initiated a transmission toward the source, a simple greeting encoded in binary, "We are listening." For a full day, nothing happened. Then the station's systems flickered. Lights dimmed. The hum of the reactors shifted, resonating in perfect synchrony with the returning signal. A voice, not mechanical but ancient, echoed faintly through the static. "Fire remembers." The sound was low and distant, like thunder traveling through stone. Elian felt the temperature drop as his console pulsed with soft amber light. The data coming through wasn't measurable anymore. It was experiential. The machines weren't just recording, they were feeling. Against protocol, Elian ordered a direct data link between the station's quantum processors and the frequency below. What followed was beyond explanation. The system began generating visuals without command, waves of light forming spirals, then faces, then landscapes that shifted between memory and dream. He saw flashes of the past, Bjorn on the battlefield, roaring into the storm, the frozen fjords burning with celestial fire, Sigrid reaching out over the edge of her ship, Cora staring into the luminous depths. The images weren't transmitted, they were remembered. The Berserker wasn't a man anymore. He was the memory of every being who had ever touched his fire. The link deepened, and Elian began to feel what he could only describe as empathy radiating from the signal. It wasn't rage now, it was understanding. A consciousness that had evolved through centuries of waiting, watching humanity rise and fall, war and rebuild, forget and rediscover. Through his trembling hands, he felt words that were not spoken but known. "You have learned the language of the storm. But do you still remember the silence?" He didn't understand at first, but then he realized what the message meant. Humanity had mastered creation, fire, technology, and gods of its own making, but it had forgotten how to listen. The Berserker's essence, once born of fury, had become the last whisper of remembrance. A reminder that strength was not in conquest, but in endurance. Rage may forge legends, but remembrance sustains them. The storm had not come to destroy, it had come to remind. Suddenly, the entire station began to vibrate as the signal reached a crescendo. The earth below shimmered with electromagnetic auroras, spiraling across the northern hemisphere. The auroras formed symbols visible even from orbit, ancient runes glowing across the night sky. Ground stations worldwide scrambled to interpret the phenomenon, broadcasting in panic. But those who stood beneath the lights felt no fear. Instead, a deep calm settled in their bones, as though the earth itself exhaled after millennia of holding its breath. The world fell into a rare, profound stillness. Then came the final pulse. One long, resonant wave that rippled across oceans, through mountains, and into the heartbeats of every living creature. Machines stilled. Lights flickered. For exactly 9 seconds, the planet seemed to hum in unison, one heartbeat shared by all. And then silence. The auroras faded. Systems rebooted. Everything returned to normal. But nothing truly was. Every device connected to the network, every database, every node, carried a fragment of the spiral now. Not a virus, not a program, something subtler. A pattern of rhythm, impossible to erase, buried within the code of human technology. Elian disappeared not long after. His final log entry contained no words, only the spiral pattern pulsing gently, followed by one sentence written in trembling script. "He is no longer storm nor man. He is the rhythm of memory itself." In the years that followed, the phenomenon came to be known as the resonance of the North. People began to dream of waves and fire, of a warrior standing between lightning and silence. Children born after the event hummed unfamiliar melodies in their sleep, their heartbeats syncing to an unseen rhythm. Some scientists claimed it was a global electromagnetic shift. Others whispered that it was evolution, that humanity had, in some inexplicable way, become part of the very memory that once haunted the sea. And though technology advanced and civilizations rose beyond the clouds, those who still ventured north spoke of a strange calm upon the water. On nights when the auroras glowed gold instead of green, they said you could hear the faint echo of footsteps walking across the horizon. Not heavy, not angry, simply steady, eternal. The Berserker, at peace at last, not as a god nor a ghost, but as the heartbeat of a world that had finally learned to remember. The centuries drifted onward, and the berserker's rhythm became the quiet breath of the world. Empires rose and fell. Oceans warmed, cooled, and shifted their borders. The great cities of glass and steel eventually crumbled into dust, overtaken by forests and silence. Humanity, scattered across stars and remnants of continents, had forgotten its origins once again. But memory is a stubborn current. It flows even when the riverbed has changed. Somewhere beneath all that silence, the pulse endured. The storm had not vanished. It had only learned to whisper. Far beyond Earth, on a distant colony orbiting a dying red sun, a young historian named Anya Voss uncovered fragments of a lost archive labeled Project Berserker. The files were degraded, half-erased, their language archaic. She was part of a generation raised on myths turned into algorithms, tales of gods, storms, and immortality translated into metaphor by education systems that believed only in logic. Yet something about the fragments stirred her. She found repeated references to the spiral, the undying flame, and the resonance of the north. Her pulse quickened as she scrolled through decoded imagery, runic spirals, auroras glowing over dark oceans, and one recurring phrase written in dozens of dead languages: "The fire remembers." Anya spent years reconstructing the data, driven by something she couldn't name. The colony had no oceans, no storms, only dust and silence. Yet every night, she dreamed of waves breaking against black cliffs and a heartbeat echoing through the wind. She heard whispers of an old name, Bjorn, the Unbroken, and each time she woke, her hands trembled with the faint warmth of fire. The dreams grew stronger, more vivid, until she could smell salt in the sterile air of her cabin. When she finally decoded the last fragment of the Berserker archive, the screen filled with cascading golden light. Words materialized slowly, as if rising through water. The storm is not bound to Earth. The memory travels where the blood goes. That night, the colony's external sensors detected a faint electromagnetic anomaly near the orbiting moon. The pulse, soft, steady, rhythmic. The same 9-second interval recorded centuries earlier. The same heartbeat. Elian Svensson's resonance, Cora Lindholm's pulse, Sigrid's signal. It was all the same thread, traveling through generations, through bloodlines, through space itself. The Berserker's fire had crossed the stars. Anya initiated a transmission, her voice trembling. "If you are out there," she whispered, "why do you still follow us?" The reply was not sound but warmth. The air shimmered. Lights flickered across the ceiling like rippling water. She felt something inside her chest, an answering beat, soft but certain. In that instant she understood. It wasn't that Bjorn followed humanity. It was that humanity carried him. His rage had become their endurance, his defiance their memory. Every act of persistence, every refusal to break, every flicker of courage in the face of silence. He was there. Not as a god, not as a legend, but as the essence of survival itself. Driven by instinct rather than reason, Anya left the colony with a small research vessel, charting a course toward the anomaly. As she approached, the stars themselves seemed to dim, swallowed by a faint spiral of light. It wasn't a storm, not anymore. It was something vast and calm, a slow-turning galaxy of energy that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. She floated closer, awestruck, as the ship's readings fluctuated wildly. The spiral reached out in a shimmer of gold and white, touching the vessel's hull like the brush of a hand. The ship's systems filled with data too complex to comprehend. Streams of runes, waves, neural patterns, human memories interlaced with something older than life. For a moment she saw him, not as a man of flesh, but as light shaped by will. His form flickered between past and present, the warrior of fire, the storm of centuries, and something luminous beyond human understanding. He looked at her not with the eyes of rage, but with peace. The weight of eternity in his gaze was gentle now, as though he had finally found what he had sought across lifetimes. No longer chained by vengeance, no longer trapped in fury, he had become the very rhythm of existence, the bridge between mortality and myth. She did not hear his voice, but she knew his words. It was never about rage. It was about remembrance. The spiral expanded, enveloping her ship in light. Time ceased to exist. There was no fear, no separation, only a vast and endless calm. She felt every heartbeat that had ever been, from the first spark of life in the northern seas to the last pulse of dying stars. In that boundless silence, she realized that immortality was never about surviving the world. It was about becoming one with it. Bjorn had not defied death. He had transformed it. His story had become the eternal rhythm through which the universe remembered itself. When the light faded, the ship was found adrift near the edge of the system. No damage, no distress signal, only a faint hum echoing through its systems. A steady pulse, slow and calm. Anya was gone. But in her logbook, the final entry glowed faintly on the cracked display. He is not gone. He is in the breath of the sea, the hum of machines, the silence between stars. The fire remembers. And so it was. Wherever storms gather, wherever light spirals, wherever hearts beat against the darkness, his memory lives, not as myth or man, but as rhythm. The story of Bjorn the Unbroken became the heartbeat of existence itself, passed from sea to storm to star, until every living thing carried a fragment of his defiance. The berserker who could not die had become the memory that would not fade. And in the infinite quiet of space, where stars drift like embers across an endless night, if one listens closely enough, one can still hear it, the sound of the first fire whispering through eternity. The soft, patient pulse of an immortal storm. When the world finally turned quiet again, centuries after Anya's disappearance, a new dawn unfolded on a reborn Earth. The oceans had returned, carving new coastlines along mountains that had once been deserts. The air was thick with mist and life again. Cities grew like coral reefs from the remnants of old civilizations, organic, luminous, pulsing with quiet intelligence. Humanity had changed, yet somewhere deep within its collective rhythm, something ancient still lingered, waiting. The berserker's fire had become something softer now, less a blaze of fury, more a glow of persistence. The rage that once fueled warriors had transformed into endurance, creativity, and an unyielding desire to understand. In the great city of New Reykjavik, built on the bones of the old, an ancient monolith was unearthed during an ocean reclamation project. It was black stone, fused with veins of metal that pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat beneath its surface. No tool could mark it, no scanner could decipher its depth. The archaeologists called it the Pulse Stone. Its discovery reignited whispers of a forgotten age, of gods and storms and a man who could not die. For the scholars of this new world, these were only myths, echoes of primitive minds. Yet when the night fell and the auroras danced above the Arctic horizon, those who stood near the monolith swore they could hear something soft, rhythmic, like breath caught between waves. Among those drawn to the site was a young dream historian named Lyra. She specialized in reconstructing ancestral memories through neural resonance, a kind of lucid archaeology of the mind. When she touched the stone, her consciousness expanded outward in a wash of light and sound. She saw flashes of battlefields shrouded in snow, of a man roaring against the storm, of ships burning on a black sea. But beneath the chaos, she felt compassion, grief, and an enduring sorrow that transcended language. The storm wasn't destruction, it was memory refusing to be silenced. She awoke trembling, her eyes filled with tears she couldn't explain. From that night onward, she dreamed in fragments of flame and frost, of a heartbeat pulsing like a drum through time. Each morning, she awoke with the faint smell of smoke clinging to her skin. Her colleagues dismissed it as neural echo interference, a side effect of overexposure to mnemonic resonance. But Lyra knew better. Something inside her recognized the rhythm, as if an old friend had reached through the centuries to whisper her name. She returned to the monolith night after night, driven by a pull beyond logic. And one evening, under a sky alive with aurora, the stone responded. Its pulse matched hers. The ground trembled softly, not in violence but in awakening. Lines of light traced ancient runes across its surface, and a low hum filled the air. The city lights flickered. Across the globe, sensors detected synchronized energy waves, gentle, harmonic, steady. It was as if the planet itself was breathing again after a long sleep. The world paused. News feeds, data streams, even digital consciousness networks, all converged into one rhythm. The same 9-second pulse. The same ancient heartbeat. Scientists tried to explain it as tectonic resonance or electromagnetic harmonics, but deep down, everyone who felt it understood. It was something older than their science, older than their civilization. It was memory stirring. Lyra stood before the glowing monolith as the auroras stretched across the sky like rivers of fire. For a brief moment, she saw through time itself, the rise of empires, the fall of stars, the passage of countless lives, all connected by a single enduring rhythm. She understood then what Bjorn had become, not a man, not a myth, but the echo of humanity's will to endure. The berserker had transcended rage to become remembrance, his fire diffused through every living heart, guiding them toward resilience. As dawn approached, the light faded back into the stone. The pulse softened until it was almost indistinguishable from the natural rhythm of the earth. But the world had changed. People began to move differently, think differently. They spoke more softly, listened more deeply. Across continents, artists painted spirals of gold and red, musicians composed songs with 9-beat measures, and builders shaped monuments that seemed to hum when touched. None could explain why. It was instinct, perhaps, or something embedded in their blood. Generations later, the story of the berserker became a quiet truth whispered to children at night. A tale not of war, but of endurance. There was once a man, they would say, who refused to die not because he feared death, but because he loved life too fiercely to let it fade. And somewhere, deep in the sea's rhythm, in the wind brushing against mountains, in the soft thrum of a newborn's heart, his fire continued to glow, subtle, eternal, unbroken. In that balance between myth and reality, humanity found peace. They no longer feared oblivion, because they understood that memory was the truest form of immortality. Rage had become rhythm. The berserker's cry had become the heartbeat of the world itself. And in that eternal pulse, steady, ancient, and kind, the world finally remembered what it meant to be alive. As centuries passed, the plague houses dissolved into legend, their stories softened by time yet never forgotten. Beneath cobblestone streets and modern cities, their foundations still rest, quiet, patient, eternal. On certain nights, when fog blankets the old towns and candles flicker behind shuttered windows, some say the air still hums with the sorrow of those who once suffered there. It isn't fear that lingers now, but remembrance, a whisper from the past reminding us how fragile life truly is, and how, even in ruin and despair, humanity endures, refusing to be erased by the silence of history.